This video will show you three major factoring techniques that we learned this year. And I'm going to start with factoring trinomials, which is when we use the MAM method. So we start by writing MAM on top of our three terms. So this tells us, we can make ourselves a little table, that the two numbers have to multiply to whatever 2 times negative 5 is, and that's negative 10. And they have to add to negative 3. So now I'm going to start playing around with the factors of 10 to hopefully get a 3 in the middle, and I have to be careful of my signs. So I know that 5 and 2 multiply to 10. If I want it to be negative 10, that means one of them has to be negative. And if I give the 5 the negative, now when I multiply, I get my negative 10. So that checks out. And when I add, I get negative 3. So that checks out. So once you find your special pair, you go back and now you have to set up two fractions. So you start by putting your lead coefficient, which is just your first coefficient, with your variable as the numerator of two fractions. Then you take those two numbers that you just found and you put them in the bottoms. So now, the reason we do this is we look and we see if we can simplify either fraction. 2 over 5, there's nothing in common, so I'm not going to be able to simplify. 2 over 2, however, if I divide them both by 2, I end up with x, or 1x, over 1. This one is going to stay the same. So now I take these two fractions that are as simplified as they can be, and I write them out as two what we call binomials. So 2x minus 5 and x plus 1. Since there's no sign here, we assume it's a plus, and that is the factored version of that trinomial. Okay, the next method I'm going to show you is a method called dots, and that stands for the difference of two squares. So difference meaning you have subtraction, so that's required, and two squares meaning that both of these terms are perfect squares. So every time we have this type of factoring situation, we always factor the same way. So I always have 1 plus and 1 minus, doesn't matter the order. And when I take the square root of x squared, I get x, so I put that in my first two spots, and then when I take the square root of 9, I get 3. So that goes in my second two spots. And that's all there is to dots. Finally, I wanted to show you one that was a little bit of a combination. So a key word here, if you ever see factor completely, you should know that that means there's probably more than one factoring technique that will need to be applied. So the very first thing I notice is that the 4 and the 16 have a factor in common. We call that a GCF. So since my GCF in this case would be 4, that means I would divide both of my terms by 4, but that number doesn't go away, that has to sit on the outside. So if I divide 4x squared by 4, I'm left with just x squared. And if I divide 16 by 4, I get 4. So right now I just pulled out a GCF. Now all of a sudden I notice this is a special type of binomial. That's another dots binomial. So I'm going to go ahead I'm going to keep that 4. And I know I'm going to go into two more binomials, 1 plus 1 minus. And I have to take my two square roots. So the square root of x squared is x. And the square root of 4 is 2. So now I have completely factored that binomial.